Welcome back to Monday Most Monstrous, the best way to start your week. We continue our journey through the wilds of Monster Hunter with the next creature in the lineup, and if you're familiar with the game, or can at least read the title of this video, you know that we're looking at the molten metal monkey, the Ajarakan. Before we begin, we're now on Patreon. You can get builds and monsters 3 weeks early there, as well as unique items and extra content. Even a little bit helps us go a long way. As I said, I'm just continuing down the line of the creatures from Wilds, and the Ajarakan is the next to be crossed off of my list. This is a nifty little creature, being a mandrill-like monster that is covered in a coppery carapace, which helps to protect it. However, the Ajarakan can use this offensively. I don't entirely understand the mechanics of it, but it is able to somehow heat up its carapace by striking it with its tail. This sends it into a molten state that allows it access to some new moves and enhances a couple of its more standard attacks. Given the ubiquity of a rage state among monsters in this series, I usually skip such a design point, but it feels a bit more pertinent here, so I do want to include something along those lines, while also representing the fact that the Ajarakan can inflict blast and fire blight alike. However, this is not a madhouse, there is an order to things here. For example, per the suggestions of the good folk on the Ready to Dice Discord, we're building it as a level 9 creature. It handles the likes of the Rompopolo pretty handily, but it is in turn absolutely thrashed by the new Udra, which tangles with 3 at once. I stuck with animal as its sort of central creature type, but I also added the metal trait, given the mineral that makes up its mantle. I did decide to exclude the fire trait, since this is another case where it simply isn't an innate enough feature of the creature to warrant it being a trait. Despite its tail and mandrill design, the Ajarakan feels a bit more ape-like to me, and does seem stronger over nimble, which led to me using a high strength for its design. This will be its primary combat stat for all of its strikes, but it is still fairly nimble, leading to the use of a moderate dexterity. That actually matches its constitution as well, because the Ajarakan honestly is kind of just a physical powerhouse, a good solid all-rounder. However, its wisdom leans towards low, and even then is the highest of its mental ability scores. I struggle to find data on its ecology, so I'm not sure how much of a hunter it actually is. This did lead to me just following its wisdom, with a low perception bonus, though I did look at other apes to land on its dark vision and scent abilities. You could further look at these apes to justify an intimidation skill, but with complexity elsewhere in its kit, I sought to keep it simple with a moderate acrobatics, since it is rather nimble, and then a high athletics, as this one does actually feature into its kit a tiny bit, perhaps most prominently in its turf war against the Rompopolo. There's a little bit going on when it comes to the Ajarakan's defenses, which does contribute to the use of a moderate armor class. This accompanies a moderate pool of hit points as well, but this use of 2 moderate values is balanced by the fact that the Ajarakan is immune to fire damage and has a low physical resistance from its metal hide. Though, it does also have a moderate weakness to water, so options such as hydraulic push and other damaging water effects are good to use against it. As a note, you can target a high AC for one of its components and break its carapace, thereby removing its physical resistance until it can heal that back up. Between this and that water weakness, I decided to have it use a high fortitude and reflex, but then a low will save, to balance it out a bit and give another weak point for the heroes to play into. Its defenses have a nice push and pull going on to them, that I hope I balance out properly, because there's quite a few parts here. For our onerous orangutan's offenses, we have 2 strikes. One is its main melee attack, and the other is its ranged rock throw, which it seems to use with some regularity. I wanna rock! In either case, we're using a high attack bonus, but have some interesting traits on both of these. Its Furious Fiery Fist featured the Agile trait, and a reach befitting its long ape-like arms, whereas the rocks that it throws have the Brutal trait, which is why its attack bonuses match. However, it can bring a bit more force to bear with its fists, leading to a moderate damage value, whereas the rock only has a low damage value. Now it is worth noting that those damage values are only for now. we do in fact have something that can change that as we get into its abilities. Now let's quit monkeying around and get right to those. Our metallic mauling macaque does have a nifty little pinning effect where it will slam its victim into the ground, which I sought to represent through a pre-existing ability. While there are a few differences, the smear action of the cave giant captures a similar idea to this effect, as the Ajarakan captures a victim and smashes them against a surface, dealing high strike damage for the effect. Obviously, this is where its athletics comes into play, though I think this remains a bit of a gamble, since his regular strikes are 1 point higher when it comes to attack. One isn't entirely better than the other. They're just different, and I think that is a good design space to work within. Now, before I can talk about either of the Ajarakan's other abilities, we have to look at its reaction. Ignite.
Flame on!
This can only be triggered once per minute, and when the Ajarakan has been reduced to half health or lower. When it does this, it begins beating its tail against its back to heat itself up and go into its charged up state. This causes creatures that come in contact with its carapace to take a mite of fire damage, while also enhancing its strikes with some extra fire damage as well. This extra damage on its strikes will push them up to be about 1 step higher than they usually are, so that its fists are around high damage and its rocks, which are now molten orbs, are at about moderate damage. Of note, your players can try to cool the Ajarakan down when it's in this state with water effects. This doesn't quite match the game, but I felt like it was a fun idea for further work-ins of its weaknesses. Alright, with that tool in our belt, that feather in our cap, we can take a look at Ground Pound. Normally, this just lets it slam down to deal its fist damage in a 15-foot cone, which will knock creatures prone on a failed save against a high DC reflex save. However, the reason we waited to look at this is because if the Ajarakan is ignited, this changes up a bit. It instead causes the ground to erupt in a wave of molten matter that deals unlimited use area damage with a basic reflex save against that same high DC. However, instead of failure knocking a creature prone, it literally makes them a match for a molten mandrill, lighting them ablaze. That just leaves us with Comet Crash, which was my attempt at replicating the Ajarakan's signature move. This involves it spinning itself around like a top, launching into the air, and then slamming back down in a grand explosion. Now, when you really break that all down, it's really just a big area burst around it with some bells and whistles. So, I made this exclusive to its ignited state, and had it be a big boom that deals limited use area damage at a high DC. However, while we kinda have the Fire Blight featured in its Ground Pound, I did say that I wanted to resemble its Blast Blight as well. And so, while it is minor, this action does scatter powder across others when they take damage from it. If this powder is not removed with a moderate DC reflex save, it will detonate after 1 full round to deal limited use area fire damage. Now, partially because of that ease of removal, and also partially because of how much it takes for the Ajarakan to pull all of this off, I did end up not using a save for this explosion. Though, if you do want one, I'd probably use a moderate DC save just like the save to remove it. When it came to crafting for this combustive capuchin, it felt like it had been a minute since I made a suit of armor. And honestly, I like the skills offered by the Ajarakan armor over those found on its weapons. That being said, what I was mainly looking at was the Resentment skill. I actually almost named this the Resent Mail, but thought that was a bit too cheesy even for me. I did provide a small damage bonus while the wearer is at half health or lower, to reference this, but then I switched up on its activation effect, making it a big boom that produces a fireball in the wearer's space. I wanted to lean into the eruption aspects associated with the Ajarakan for this effect, calling to mind some of its own blast attacks, while being something that you might not want to be doing in the midst of your party. And that's the Ajarakan. Masked in metal, this molten mandrill makes mincemeat out of many, mashing and mangling while making magma mount until it manages a magnificent manifestation. The Ajarakan was a neat creature to play around with. I feel like it's a little simpler than most Monhun creatures that I've made recently, but I don't think that's remotely a bad thing, and there's still enough complexity here to be interesting in my opinion. I don't think they really get into what metals the Ajarakans use in their shell, but it might make for an interesting encounter to feature one that's infused with some of the more unique metals of Pathfinder, such as Abyssium or Cold Sicatite, giving it new effects. That being said, let me know what you think of the critter and what other monsters I should make. If you dig this one, let me know with a like and a subscribe. I want to give a big thanks to the folks on the Patreon, with a special mention going to the Orc Overlords, Decaffeinate, Shy Benster, and Vorthus. You too could head on over there for early access to the vids and extra content. Either way, thanks for watching, and have a monstrous Monday.